For 4 decades, Margaret Miller had shared her life with Henry. All those years he'd kept the old barn behind their Yorkshire farm under lock and key, claiming it was his workshop, a place where women weren't allowed. When Henry died of a sudden heart attack, Margaret finally worked up the courage to break the heavy padlock. The discovery she made inside left her stunned. As it turned out, Henry hadn't just been hiding a secret, he had been living an entire life she knew nothing about. Margaret Miller stood at the sink of her farmhouse in Oakwood, her gaze fixed on the old barn that had stood like a silent guardian over their 40-year marriage. Her arthritic hands clutched a now-cold cup of coffee as the autumn wind whistled through the gaps in the old window frames. It had been 3 weeks since Henry had collapsed, lifeless, while milking the cows. Massive heart attack, the doctor had concluded, a quick end for a man who had toiled his entire life. Margaret was 77, Henry had just turned 80. They had met as teenagers, married when she was 20, and spent 4 decades side by side on this farm. And yet Margaret felt as if she had never truly known her husband. The barn was Henry's sacred domain. It was a large weathered grey timber building with a red tile roof, standing about 100 yards from the main house. It was the largest barn in the area, but Henry had never used it for farming. Instead, he would go there every morning, after breakfast, disappear for hours, and only return for lunch. Whenever Margaret had asked what he was doing, Henry had replied curtly that it was men's business she wouldn't understand. Margaret had accepted it, just as she had accepted many things during their marriage. Henry was a man of the old school, born in 1943, raised in an era when the roles of men and women were rigidly defined. He was never cruel or unkind, but he was secretive, distant, a man who buried his emotions deep inside. They hadn't had children, not for lack of trying, but because of Margaret's infertility, a fact Henry never directly blamed her for, but never truly forgave her for either. She saw it in his eyes, in the way he watched other families with their children, in the silence that fell between them whenever the subject came up. The barn was secured by a massive padlock, and Henry always carried the only key. Even at night he kept it on his bedside table, as if he feared Margaret might, in a fit of nocturnal curiosity, uncover his secrets. Margaret recalled an incident from about 15 years ago. She had gone to the garden to pick vegetables when she heard a strange sound coming from the barn. It sounded like music, like children's nursery rhymes. She had approached, but when Henry saw her, he stormed out of the barn like a fury and scolded her more harshly than ever before. His reaction was so violent that Margaret, shocked, had backed away. Henry apologized later, blaming fatigue and stress, but Margaret never forgot the look on his face in that moment. It wasn't anger, it was fear. After the funeral, neighbors and friends urged her to finally see what Henry had been up to in that barn. There could be valuables or important papers inside, but Margaret had hesitated, not out of fear of what she might find, but from a strange sense of loyalty to her late husband. Henry had so desperately wanted this secret to remain his. On the other hand, she was now alone on this large farm. She had to make practical decisions, manage the estate, maybe even consider selling. She couldn't just stand in front of a locked barn forever, wondering what was inside. On this dreary October day, as the wind stripped the last leaves from the trees, Margaret finally made her decision. She went to Henry's old workbench in the garage and grabbed a heavy pair of bolt cutters. Her hands trembled as she walked toward the barn, but her resolve was firm. The padlock was old but strong. It took her several minutes and all her strength for the bolt cutters to snap through it. When the lock fell with a metallic clang, Margaret paused. Her heart was pounding, a mix of excitement and apprehension churning within her. Slowly she pushed open the heavy wooden doors. They groaned on their hinges, releasing an odor that surprised her. It smelled of varnish, paint, and something else. A sweet, nostalgic scent. Margaret stepped into the barn, and what she saw took her breath away. The barn was nothing like Margaret had imagined. Instead of farm equipment, she found herself in a completely different world. Henry had transformed the entire barn into a gigantic workshop for handmade wooden toys. Everywhere she looked, there were rocking horses with lovingly carved manes, dollhouses with miniature furniture, and small cars with working wheels. The walls were lined with shelves filled with children's books and brightly bound fairy tales. Margaret walked as if in a dream through this magical world. One dollhouse turned out to be a perfect replica of their own farmhouse. Every detail was exquisitely rendered. In one corner she found a desk with hundreds of letters on it. Margaret recognized Henry's handwriting. They were letters addressed to children named Louise, Thomas, Emma, Paul, Sophie, names she had never heard before. In them, Henry wrote about gifts, birthdays, and small achievements. He signed every letter, "Your Grandpa Henry." All the letters were addressed to the same place, St. Jude's Children's Home in London. The oldest ones dated back to the early 1980s. Margaret found photographs of a younger Henry, 20 years her junior, surrounded by smiling children. He was holding them, reading them stories, playing with them. His face radiated a warmth she had rarely seen in their 40 years of marriage. Henry hadn't just sent toys, he had donated money, paid for school fees, and funded university educations. A letter from 2015 particularly touched her. A young woman named Louise thanked Henry for making it possible for her to study medicine. He had changed the course of her life. Margaret felt tears of confusion welling up in her eyes. The man she had lived with for 40 years had been a secret guardian angel to dozens of children. But why had he hidden it? On the wall hung a calendar with appointments noted. Visit St. Jude's, Louise's wedding, Thomas's graduation. Until just a few weeks before his death, Henry had been planning to visit his family. His children probably didn't know Henry was gone. They were still waiting for their Grandpa Henry. The next morning, Margaret called St. Jude's Children's Home. When she introduced herself as Henry's widow, Sister Anne, the nun on the other end of the line, was immediately overcome with emotion. Henry had been like a father to their children for over 40 years. She was just starting to worry. Margaret confessed she knew nothing about his connection to the home. Sister Anne was perplexed. Henry had always said his wife fully supported his work. Henry had lied, to her and to the children's home. 2 hours later, Margaret was standing in front of the old red brick building in London. Sister Anne gave her a tour and told her Henry's story. Since 1981, he had come every Monday, bringing toys, reading stories, and making donations. The children all called him Grandpa Henry. For 40 years, Henry had led a double life. He remembered every birthday, every exam, every milestone. Many of his children were now adults with families of their own, but they still came to visit him. Sister Anne explained that Henry had once confessed to her that he couldn't be the man at home that he truly was. Here, with the children, he could express his love without fear. Margaret was beginning to understand. Without realizing it, she had kept Henry in an emotional prison for decades. Louise was an attractive woman in her 40s, the little girl from the photos, all grown up. She broke down in tears upon learning of Henry's death. He was the only father she had ever known. She told her story, how she arrived at the home at age 5 after her parents died. Do you love this story? If so, give us a like and subscribe to the channel. Now let's get back to the video. She had been completely traumatized and nonverbal. Henry would just sit with her on Mondays, never pushing, bringing her small carved wooden animals. After 6 months she started speaking again. Her first word was Grandpa, directed at Henry. That day Margaret met 3 more of his children. Thomas, a teacher to whom Henry had given self-confidence. Emma, an engineer he had taught to read. And Paul, a chef who had discovered his passion in Henry's little kitchen at the home. They all told similar stories, painting a picture of Henry as a patient mentor and a loving father figure. And they were all stunned to learn that Margaret knew nothing of their existence. Henry had told them she supported his work but was simply too private to join him. Margaret recognized it with a pang of pain. Henry had lived 2 lives, one with her, marked by quiet resignation, and the other here, full of love and purpose. Sister Anne asked a crucial question. How did Margaret used to react when Henry showed his emotions? Margaret thought back and the reality hit her. She had often dismissed it as sentimentality, saying that men don't cry. She was the one who had taught Henry to suppress his feelings. Here he had found a place where he could express them, just not with her. The night after her visit to the home, Margaret couldn't sleep. The next morning she went back to the barn, searching for answers. In an old wooden cabinet behind a stack of children's drawings, she found a letter addressed to her in Henry's familiar hand. For Margaret, if I die before I have the courage to tell her. With a trembling hand she opened the envelope. Henry wrote that if she was reading this, it meant he was gone and she had found his secret. He imagined she was wondering why he had hidden the most important thing in the world to him for 40 years. The answer was both simple and shameful. He had been a coward. When the doctor told them all those years ago that they couldn't have children, she had been stronger than him. She had accepted it, saying they had to live the life God gave them. She was pragmatic, sensible, an adult. He was not. The pain of not having children had nearly destroyed him. He had cried at night while she slept. He had envied other families to the point of physical pain. He felt like less of a man, like a failure. But he couldn't tell her that because he saw how brave she was. He didn't want to burden her strength with his weakness. In 1981, he went to St. Jude's for the first time, not out of charity, he admitted, but out of pure selfishness. He needed children in his life, even if they weren't his own. What happened next changed everything. His children needed him as much as he needed them. For the first time in his life, he felt like the man he was meant to be, loving, needed, important. But the more his children became a part of his life, the more he feared telling her. He thought she would see it as a betrayal, proof that he didn't value their life together enough. The truth was, he had loved her, Margaret, every single day of their 40-year marriage, but he hadn't known how to show her the real him without hurting or disappointing her. The children at the home gave him a chance to be the Henry he always wanted to be, even at home. But he had been too much of a coward to share that Henry with her. He knew it wasn't an excuse. He had hidden half his heart from her for 40 years. He had lied and hidden out of fear. He asked for her forgiveness, not just for the secrets, but for never giving her the chance to love the man he truly was. He would miss the children from the home. They were his family, just as she was, but they didn't know he was gone. He asked Margaret to tell them that Grandpa Henry had loved them until his last breath, and he hoped she could forgive him. Margaret read the letter 3 times before setting it down. Tears streamed down her face, not just of sadness, but a complex mix of love, anger, regret, and understanding. Henry had been right. She probably would have seen his emotional side as a weakness. She was raised in a generation where men were expected to be strong and silent. She had unconsciously expected him to suppress his feelings. But 40 years he had led a double life, lied, hidden. She found his will in the drawer. Henry had indeed left half his fortune to the children's home, a considerable sum that would ensure his work continued. She thought of Louise, Thomas, Emma, Paul, and all the others. They were mourning a Henry they didn't even know was gone. They were waiting for Grandpa Henry to arrive on Monday, just as he had for 40 years. Margaret made a decision that would change her life forever. 3 months later, Margaret stood in the barn, but she was no longer alone. Louise was there, along with Thomas and Emma, who brought her 2 young children. The barn was filled with life, with laughter, with the love Henry had secretly nurtured for so long. Margaret had made a difficult choice. She had not only informed the home of Henry's passing, but had also decided to continue his work. Not to replace Henry, that would be impossible, but to become the woman she might have been if she had been braver. Emma's 6-year-old daughter asked if she could make her a rocking horse like Grandpa Henry used to. Margaret smiled. She had been learning woodworking over the past few months, slowly, with many mistakes, but with a determination that surprised even herself. She was 77 years old, but for the first time in her life, she felt truly alive. She told little Julie that she could try, but it wouldn't be as good as Grandpa Henry's. The little girl hugged Margaret's legs and said that didn't matter. She was still learning. Louise came over to her. Over the months, they had become true friends, bonded by their shared love for Henry and their shared grief for what could have been. She told her that Henry would be proud of Margaret. Margaret replied that she wasn't so sure. She was just making up for 40 lost years. Saint-Ouen, Jude's had set up a workshop with Henry's legacy, where Margaret now worked with the children every Tuesday. She wasn't as skilled as Henry, nor as patient, nor as wise, but she was there, and she was learning. She was learning to show her emotions. She was learning that tears are not a sign of weakness. She was learning that love must be shared to grow. The children called her Grandma Margaret, and slowly she was starting to understand what Henry had felt all those years. His children needed her, and she needed them. It was a mutual exchange that gave her life a purpose she had never known. That afternoon, sitting in the barn with Henry's family, Margaret found a peace she hadn't known she was looking for 40 years. Henry was gone, but his love lived on. In the people he had touched, in the toys that continued to bring joy to children's hearts, in the workshop where Margaret learned a little more each day about being the woman she could have always been. She understood now that Henry hadn't cheated on her. He had cheated himself, and her along with him, but it was never too late for the truth, never too late for love. Margaret looked at the photo of Henry she had hung in the barn. He was surrounded by smiling children, wearing the happiest expression she had ever seen on his face. She whispered that she understood now, and that she forgave him. The wind blew through the open barn doors, and Margaret felt as if Henry were smiling. The secret was finally out, and the love that had bloomed in the shadows for so long could finally flourish in the light. That evening, after everyone had left, Margaret sat down at Henry's desk and wrote her first letter to the children at the home. She introduced herself as Grandpa Henry's wife, explaining that he was in heaven now, watching over them. She was here, and she wanted to learn to love them as he had. She folded the letter and placed it with the others Henry had written. Tomorrow she would go to the home and begin a new chapter, the one she and Henry should have written together. The barn was no longer a place of secrets. It was a place of memory, of love, and of hope, and Margaret was finally home, with herself and with the family Henry had built for them both. If this story showed you that it's never too late to discover the truth and respond with love, please leave a like and share the video. Margaret and Henry taught us that sometimes the biggest secrets are born from love, and that forgiveness is the key to a fulfilled life. Subscribe to our channel for more moving stories about family, love, and second chances. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story that will touch your heart.